I didn't look at my phone for 3 days, not because I was busy, not because I forgot, because I knew if I looked at it, I would call my son and say something I couldn't take back. And I had spent 61 years learning when to speak and when to stay quiet. This was a time to stay quiet. This was a time to stay quiet for a little while longer. Let me start from the beginning. My son, my only child, had been with his girlfriend for 4 years before he proposed. I was happy for him. I tried to be anyway. There was always something about her that made me hold my breath a little when she walked into a room. I couldn't explain it to anyone. His grandmother loved her. His aunt said she was wonderful. My best friend of 30 years told me I was being a protective mother and I needed to let go. Maybe she was right. I told myself she was right. I went to bridal showers and cake tastings and venue tours, and I smiled through all of it. I bought a mother of the groom dress that cost more than my first car. I told myself I was ready. Then, on a Wednesday evening in October, 11 days before the wedding, I found out I hadn't been wrong at all. It started with a box. I was cleaning out the storage closet in my basement, the one my late husband had used as his office before he got sick. He passed 4 years ago, just a few months before my son started dating her, actually. I had never fully gone through that closet. Every time I tried, I'd get as far as pulling out one folder or one box, and then I'd have to sit down on the floor and just breathe for a while. That Wednesday, I decided I was finally going to do it. I had music playing. I had coffee. I was going to be strong. His old laptop was in a box near the back. I hadn't turned it on since he was in the hospital. The battery was dead, so I plugged it in and let it charge while I went through other things. An hour later, out of habit or grief or just plain curiosity, I opened it. His email was still logged in. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I was looking at his inbox the way you look at a person's handwriting after they're gone. Not looking for anything, just wanting to feel close to them again. His emails were mostly what I expected. Work things. A few notes from old friends. An airline confirmation from a trip we took to Portland the summer before he got sick. And then I saw a name I recognized. Her name. My future daughter-in-law's name. In my dead husband's inbox. I sat down so fast I nearly knocked over my coffee. The first email was from 2 years before my husband died. She had been 26 at the time. My husband had been 57. The subject line was blank. I almost didn't open it. I opened it. I will not tell you everything that was in those emails. Some things stay between me and God and the four walls of that basement. What I will tell you is this. It had been going on for almost 8 months. My husband, the man I had been married to for 33 years, the deacon of our church, the man who read scripture at my mother's funeral, had carried on a secret relationship with a woman who, 2 years after his death, would become engaged to our son. I sat on that cold concrete floor for I don't know how long. The music was still playing, some old gospel song I used to love. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, and I thought very slowly and very clearly, my son cannot marry this woman. The question was how. I am not a dramatic person by nature. I do not make scenes. I did not march upstairs and call my son that night. I didn't call anyone. I poured out the rest of my coffee, turned off the music, went upstairs, and I made myself a bowl of soup, and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought, just thought, for a long time. The wedding was 11 days away. Invitations had been sent to 230 people. The venue was booked, a beautiful hall out in Roswell, Georgia, 40 minutes from where we lived. The caterer was paid. The photographer was paid. The photographer was paid. My son had spent close to $18,000 on this wedding, most of it already gone. I thought about calling it off, right then and there. Picking up the phone, telling my son to come over, and laying the laptop on the table in front of him and walking out of the room. Part of me wanted to do exactly that, but I knew my son. I knew how much he loved her. I knew that if I showed up with an 11-year-old laptop and some emails and told him his bride had been sleeping with his father, there was a real chance he would look at me like I had lost my mind. He would want to believe it wasn't true. She would cry and deny it, and he would choose to believe her, and I would be the grieving widow who cracked under pressure. I'd seen it happen to other women. I was not going to let that happen to me. So I thought about it differently. I needed him to know the truth in a way that he could not argue with, in a way that left no room for doubt. And I needed to stay calm enough to make that happen. The next morning, I called my cousin's daughter, a young woman of about 30 who works in IT, sharp as a tack, and I asked her to come over. I told her I needed help with a computer. I didn't tell her anything else, not yet. When she came by that evening, I showed her what I'd found. I watched her face change as she read. She put the laptop down and looked at me for a long moment. "Auntie," she said. She always called me Auntie. "What do you want to do?" "I want to make sure I have everything," I said. "Every email, dates, times, all of it. I want it printed. I want it backed up. I want it somewhere he can't say I made it up." She spent 3 hours with me that night. She found not just the emails but photographs, attached to messages stored in a folder my husband had apparently created and named something innocuous, something I won't repeat. She found a deleted thread that she was able to partially recover. By the time she left, we had printed 61 pages of documentation. 61 pages. I stacked them on my kitchen table, and I stood there and I looked at them for a long time. The total I spent at the office supply store the next day, getting everything properly copied and organized, was $188. I remember the exact amount because I stood at the counter and thought, this is what the truth costs sometimes. $188 and your whole heart. Now here's the part people always ask me about. The part where they look at me sideways and say, "But why didn't you just tell him then? Why wait?" I've thought about how to explain this more times than I can count. The simplest way I know is this. I needed my son to be in a position where he couldn't minimize what he was seeing. If I called him to my house on a Tuesday and said, "Sit down, I have to show you something," she would be with him, or he'd call her the moment he left. And whatever story she came up with in that moment would be the story he'd be hearing in his head while he looked at those pages. I needed him to see it without her voice in the room. I needed there to be no escape route, no private conversation in a car on the way home where she could explain it all away. My son's rehearsal dinner was 5 days before the wedding at a restaurant in Buckhead where they'd reserved the back room. Family, close friends, the wedding party. 32 people. I had already been asked to say a few words. I decided that was where I would do it. Not a scene. Not a breakdown. Just the truth, presented clearly, in a room full of people who loved my son enough to help him through what came next. I spent 4 days preparing. I bought a nice leather portfolio at the office store, $12, and I placed copies of the most critical pages inside, just the ones that told the clearest story. Dates, names, her words in her own handwriting, and one message she'd apparently typed by hand and photographed. I didn't need all 61 pages. I needed the 10 that were undeniable. During those 4 days, I went to work. I went to church. I brought dinner to my neighbor down the street who had just had knee surgery. I helped my son pick up his tuxedo when he called and asked if I'd ride along. I sat in the car while he tried it on, and I looked at his face. So happy, so excited, and I made myself a promise. Whatever happened at that dinner, whatever came after, I was going to be there for him. Not just to expose the truth, but to catch him when he fell. The night of the rehearsal dinner, I got dressed in a navy blue dress I'd bought for the occasion, and I put the portfolio in my bag, and I drove to Buckhead by myself. I arrived early. I found the restaurant manager, and I asked for a private moment with him. I explained calmly that during the toast portion of the evening, I would need 1 minute where I stepped away from the microphone and distributed some papers to guests, specifically to my son, before I continued speaking. I didn't explain why. I just asked. He looked at me a little strangely, but he said yes. My son was already there when I walked into the back room. He hugged me. He looked so handsome. His fiancée was standing near the window with a glass of wine, and she smiled when she saw me. And I smiled back. And I thought, you have no idea what is coming. I didn't feel hatred in that moment, which surprised me. I mostly just felt tired and certain. Dinner went the way rehearsal dinners go. Laughter, stories, a little too much wine. Her parents were there. Her father, a quiet man from Savannah, and her mother, who talked too much and too loud. I sat next to my cousin and made conversation, and ate my salmon, and waited. When the toasts began, the best man went first. Then her maid of honor, Then her father said something brief and sweet. Then the room looked at me. I stood up. I thanked everyone for being there. I talked about my son, what he was like as a little boy, how proud his father would have been to see him standing at that altar. I meant every word. I saw my son's eyes get bright, and I felt my throat tighten, but I stayed steady. Then I paused. I reached into my bag and I took out the portfolio. I said, "Before I finish, I need to share something with my son. Something I found recently that I believe he has the right to know before he makes this commitment." I kept my voice even, not shaking, not dramatic, even. I walked to my son and I placed the portfolio in his hands. I said, "Take your time with this." Then I stepped back. The room went very quiet. He looked at me. Then he looked down and opened the portfolio. I watched his face. I had told myself I would watch his face because I needed to know the moment he understood. It took about 45 seconds. His eyes moved down the first page slowly, then faster. He turned to the second page. Then he stopped. He looked up at her. She had gone the color of old chalk. He said her name, just her name, very quiet. The whole room heard it. She started to speak and he held up one hand and she stopped. He looked back down at the pages. He turned to a third page. I saw him find the message she had written by hand. His jaw tightened. Then he closed the portfolio. He set it on the table very carefully, like it was something fragile. He stood up. He said, "I need a few minutes," and he walked out of the back room and through the restaurant and out the front door. I followed him. Nobody stopped me. He was standing on the sidewalk on Peachtree Road with his hands in his pockets, looking at the traffic going by. It was a Thursday night in October, and the air was cool and the streetlights were just coming on. I stood next to him and I didn't say anything. I had said enough. After a while he said, "How long have you known?" I said, 6 days. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Why didn't you come to me right away?" I told him the truth. I said, "Because I needed you to see it for yourself, with your own eyes, without anyone telling you what to think about it." He didn't say anything for a long time, and then he said very quietly, "I would have believed you." I don't know if that's true. I know he believes it's true, and maybe that's enough. We stood on that sidewalk for about 20 minutes. At some point his groomsmen came out and stood nearby without saying anything, which I thought was exactly right of them. Eventually he went back inside. She was still there. She was crying. Her mother had her arms around her. He walked up to her and he said, also quietly, "I need you to go home tonight." She started to say something and he said, "Please, just go home." She went. The room was awkward and strange after that, the way rooms get when something real has happened in them. People didn't know whether to leave or stay. I thanked everyone for coming. I said the wedding was being postponed. I asked them to give my son some privacy. People were kind. They gathered their things and filed out, and most of them hugged my son on the way by. The cancellations took most of the next week. The venue was non-refundable, which cost him $1,200. The caterer returned half the deposit. The photographer was gracious and returned everything. The dress was a loss. All told, he was out close to $9,000. I offered to help him with some of it. He refused at first. I left a check on his kitchen counter anyway. Now here's the part I have to be honest about, the part that is harder to tell. She called me about 3 weeks later. I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. She talked for a long time. She told me things I hadn't known. That she had been in a deeply destructive period of her life when it happened. That she had been in therapy since. That she had spent years trying to become someone different. She did not make excuses. She said more than once, "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't have the right to ask that." She said she knew what she'd taken from our family. She said she was sorry in a way that sounded like someone who had practiced saying it, but meant it anyway. I listened. I didn't speak much. When she was done, I said, "I hear you." I didn't say I forgave her. I'm not sure I do yet. Forgiveness is something I'm working on, not for her sake, but for mine. My pastor has a saying, Bitterness is a house you build to punish someone else, and then realize you're the one who has to live in it. I am not ready to let her off the hook, but I am also not willing to let what she did take up any more room inside me than it already has. My son took it hard. Of course he did. He loved her. He had been planning a life with her. For the first few months, there were nights he'd call me late and we'd just stay on the phone, not really talking, just present. I did that for him as long as he needed it. He started seeing a therapist in January. A good one, a black man about his age from Decatur who he connected with right away. He said it helped. It is now 8 months since that October night on the sidewalk on Peachtree Road. My son is doing better. He went on a trip with some friends in the spring. New Orleans, which he'd always wanted to visit. He came back looking lighter than he had in years. He's been spending more time at his church. He took up running, of all things, and now texts me his mileage every Sunday like I'm supposed to be impressed. I am impressed. I don't tell him that enough. People sometimes ask me if I regret how I did it. Waiting until the rehearsal dinner, not telling him sooner, more privately. I understand why they ask. I have asked myself the same question many times, usually around 3 in the morning. What I come back to is this. My son needed to be the one who decided what to do with the truth, not me. I gave him the information. I made sure he had it in an undeniable form, in a space where the people who loved him were present. What he did with it was his choice. He chose to walk away. That was his dignity. I was not going to take that from him by making the decision for him weeks before, while she still had access to him and time to spin her story. Was it painful to watch? Yes. Was watching the look on his face when he read those pages one of the hardest things I have ever done in my life? Yes. Do I wish none of it had happened every single day? But my son is free, and I watched him become free right there in that restaurant in Buckhead on a Thursday night in October, with the salmon getting cold on the table behind us. That has to count for something. My late husband's laptop is still in the basement. I have not decided what to do with it. There are days I think I should just take it to one of those electronics recycling places and be done with it. There are other days. I don't know what I think on those other days. That grief is complicated, that people are complicated, that 33 years of marriage can contain more than you know about. I am still that woman's mother-in-law in name, I suppose, for the few months until the legal pieces are finalized. After that, I don't know what I will be. A woman who made it through something. A mother who kept her promise to catch her son when he fell. His grandmother always told me, the truth doesn't need your help being true. It just needs you to be brave enough to let it out. I was brave enough. That's all I know how to say. I think about that sidewalk a lot. Peachtree Road on a Thursday night, the streetlights just coming on, my son standing there with his hands in his pockets looking at nothing. That image stays with me the way certain things do. Not because it was the worst moment, but because it was the turning point. Everything before it was weight being carried. Everything after it was something else. What I keep coming back to is this. Actions have a way of completing themselves. Not always quickly, not always loudly, but what was done in that basement years ago, the deception, the betrayal, the careful hiding of something that should never have existed, it didn't disappear just because my husband died. It sat in an inbox. It waited. And when the time came, it found its way into the light, the way all hidden things eventually do, one way or another. I didn't go looking for it. I was just finally ready to open a box. That's something I've had to sit with. The fact that my husband made choices I will never fully understand. The fact that the woman my son loved had made choices she spent years trying to run from. Nobody in this story was purely anything. But the consequences of those choices kept moving forward long after the people who made them thought they were safe. What I know is that I had a decision to make. And the decision I made came from 3 things I have tried to live by my whole life, even when I didn't have words for them. The first is knowing right from wrong and being willing to act on it, even when it costs you something. It would have been easier, so much easier, to close that laptop and put it back in that box and let my son walk down the aisle and never say a word. Nobody would have known. I would have known, and it would have eaten me alive. But I could have done it. I didn't, because I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if I had. The second is thinking clearly when everything in you wants to fall apart. I could have called my son that Wednesday night, hysterical, and handed him a mess instead of a truth. I had to slow down. I had to think. I had to figure out not just what to say, but how to say it so it could actually land. That took patience I didn't know I had. The third is simply not quitting, sitting with that weight for 11 days, going to work, riding to pick up a tuxedo, smiling at a woman I knew had betrayed my family because I wasn't ready yet and I needed to stay steady. That kind of quiet endurance doesn't get recognized very often. But it's the thing that made everything else possible. My son is running on Sunday mornings now and texting me his mileage like I'm supposed to care about miles. I care about miles. I care about every single one. I don't know that I did everything right, but I know I did the thing I could live with. And some days that's the only measure that matters.